Here's exactly why Saruman feared Galadriel. For a guy who could bend kings and wizards to his will with a casual conversation, she was the one locked door he could never pick. Think about the sheer psychological weight Saruman carried across Middle-earth. As the head of the Istari and leader of the White Council, he was widely considered the most intellectually dominant and formidable figure around. He wasn't just a wizard with a staff. He was a master, bending lesser minds to his will using nothing but the cadence of his own voice. If he wanted to manipulate a political strategist who could rewrite the loyalties of kings, shatter ancient alliances, and bend nation, he simply dropped a few poisonous whispers into the right ear and watched the dominoes fall exactly as planned. Yet, despite this absolute monopoly on intellectual leverage, his legendary silver tongue completely stalled whenever he found himself standing in front of the Lady of Lothlórien. Every calculated trick and every subtle layer of charm he used to manage the rest of Middle-earth's leadership just bounced right off of her. It wasn't that they openly argued or traded magical blows across a crowded room, but rather that his usual tools of psychological dominance simply ceased to function in her presence, leaving him entirely powerless to sway her. And that stubborn wall made total sense once you looked at her actual birth certificate. To understand why she couldn't be swayed, you have to realize that Saruman was essentially an academic dealing with a first-hand witness. While he sat inside the Tower of Isengard meticulously analyzing ancient scrolls, studying the history of power, corruption, and political greed as purely theoretical concepts, Galadriel was entirely different. She didn't need to read the history books because she actually lived through the horrific, bloody chapters that filled those pages. She walked under the literal radiant light of the two trees in Valinor before the sun or the moon were even created. She personally witnessed the devastating cataclysms of the First Age, watching how raw ambition, unchecked pride, and beautiful, shiny objects could completely rip legendary families and massive empires apart. When Saruman tried to use his polished, intellectual arguments to justify his grand, industrial visions for the future of Middle-earth, she recognized the exact psychological cadence of that manipulative language. She had already seen that specific brand of elite arrogance completely ruin a continent, making his modern political theories look incredibly childish and transparent. That massive gap in real-world perspective eventually triggered a public embarrassment he never truly forgave. When the heavy hitters of Middle-earth finally got together to set up the White Council, Saruman honestly thought the leadership spot was a done deal. In his mind, he was the chief of the wizards, so obviously the big chair belonged to him. But Galadriel completely ruined his little power trip by openly telling everyone that Gandalf should be the one running the show instead. She saw right through Saruman's obsession with titles and status. She knew that Gandalf, who actually spent his time walking among ordinary people, had a way better grip on the real dangers creeping into the world. Now, Gandalf actually turned down the job, which meant Saruman got to keep his precious title. But the damage to his massive ego was already done. Galadriel had basically handed him a quiet vote of no confidence in a room full of his peers. And for a guy as arrogant as Saruman, that kind of public snub doesn't just go away. It turned into a bitter, ugly grudge that he carried with him for the rest of his life. But his petty annoyance quickly spiked into straight-up paranoia whenever they had to meet behind closed doors. Saruman's entire operation relied heavily on his ability to curate pristine, flawless public masks. He was a master actor who spent centuries perfecting his expressions, his vocal tones, and his rhetorical arguments to ensure everyone saw him exactly how he wanted to be seen. He could hide a dark motive behind a warm, grandfatherly smile better than anybody else. Galadriel, however, possessed a terrifying telepathic ability to search the minds of others, meaning his rehearsed logic was completely useless. When Saruman looked at her, he wasn't just dealing with a smart critic. He was standing before an intellectual mirror that effortlessly bypassed his outward performance to read the thoughts underneath. He couldn't hide behind a clever turn of phrase or an administrative excuse because she was constantly tracking the underlying truth of his intent. It stripped him of his only real defense mechanism. The sheer psychological horror of being entirely defenseless against her gaze forced him into a state of constant, defensive exhaustion whenever they interacted. That mental vulnerability made his secret nighttime hobbies a massive liability. As the centuries dragged on, Saruman started secretly messing around with the dark arts, obsessing over how the One Ring worked and quietly building up his industrial war machine at Isengard. The guy was living a complete double life, working overtime to look like the ultimate champion of good while hoarding forbidden lore in the shadows. His absolute worst nightmare during this whole phase was having to stand in the same room as Galadriel. Seriously, when you're hiding a massive, world-altering secret, being near someone who has zero blind spots is actual mental torture. Every time he had to sit next to her at a council meeting, he felt like he was playing Russian roulette with his career. He wasn't worried about her finding physical evidence, like a misplaced book or a sketchy scroll. He was terrified she would catch a tiny shift in his posture, a slight crack in his voice, or just the weird energy that people give off when they're rotting from the inside out. He became completely obsessed with the idea that his private greed was a giant, glowing stain she could see instantly, making every casual conversation feel like an exhausting game of survival. And honestly, that internal rot became impossible to hide once they both faced the exact same temptation. The real difference between these two comes down to how they handled the temptation of the One Ring. Saruman completely lost his mind over it without ever even seeing the thing in person. His massive brain just folded under the mere idea of its power, which is why he ended up building a cheap, knockoff version of Mordor in his own backyard at Isengard. He just didn't have the mental grit to fight off that invisible pull. Galadriel, however, on the other hand, had to face the real deal when Frodo literally held it out to her on his open palm. She felt the full, terrifying weight of that dark power, even visualizing herself as this beautiful, tyrannical queen ruling the entire world. But instead of breaking, she fought off her internal demons, turned down the weapons, and chose to fade away into the west. Saruman had to watch this massive moral victory from the sidelines, and it gave him a serious inferiority complex. He had to face the brutal idea that the exact same object that effortlessly broke his brilliant mind was something she had the spiritual strength to walk away from, proving she was operating on a completely different level. And that massive gap in raw spiritual power became impossible to ignore their last actual battle together. When the White Council finally launched an attack on the ruined fortress of Dol Guldur, Saruman went in expecting a standard tactical display of wizardry. He brought his immense lore and studied arts to the battlefield, fully prepared to lead the charge against the Shadow. But what he actually witnessed during that confrontation fundamentally shattered his perception of his own dominance. Faced with the rising spirit of Sauron, Galadriel didn't just cast a spell. She tapped into an ancient, blinding reservoir of light that completely bypassed Saruman's academic understanding of magic. She stepped forward as a towering figure of primordial power, raising the Phial of Eärendil and single-handedly banishing the Dark Lord into the east. Watching her unleash that terrifying, luminous wrath made Saruman realize his own limitations. All his complex books, mechanical calculations, and political schemes looked incredibly small compared to the raw, unadulterated spiritual force she carried natively in her veins, leaving him feeling utterly outclassed in his own domain. It brought his lifelong anxiety to a head, forcing him to confront a terrifying truth. When you strip away the grand mythology, Saruman's deep-seated dread had absolutely nothing to do with the threat of physical elven armies marching on Isengard, nor was he worried about a dramatic magical duel under the stars. His panic was entirely rooted in a much deeper, more agonizing reality. Saruman didn't fear Galadriel because she possessed more destructive power. He feared her because she could see exactly who he was becoming, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. Every single performance he gave, every lie he manufactured to justify his descent into darkness was completely transparent to her. For a man who built his entire identity on being the smartest, most untouchable authority figure in the room, standing before her meant being completely naked. He was a fraud who knew he had been caught, forced to live with the agonizing knowledge that his pristine reputation was completely dead in the eyes of the one person whose respect he secretly craved the most. Do you think Saruman would have turned out differently if he had actually listened to her from the very beginning?